Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this event. My name is Mahvish Ahmad. I'm an assistant professor in human rights and politics in the Department of Sociology here at LSE and with the Center for Human Rights here at LSE. Let me begin by welcoming you all to this event called On Jihad, Empire and Solidarity. It's a book launch for Dr. Darryl Li's new monograph, The Universal Enemy, Jihad, Empire, and the Challenge of Solidarity. We're joined by Darryl Li himself, an anthropologist and attorney working at the intersection of war, law, migration, empire, and race, with a focus on trans-regional linkages between the Middle East, South Asia, and the Balkans. He's also an assistant professor in anthropology and social sciences at the University of Chicago, and of course, the author of the book that we'll be speaking about today. We're also joined by two brilliant scholars, our discussants on our panel today, who will be engaging with Darryl's book and his scholarship. Dr. Catherine Baker is a specialist in post-Cold War history, international relations, and cultural studies, including the post-Yugoslav region in a transnational and global context. And she is also a senior lecturer at the University of Hull. Professor Tarak Barkawi is a historian of war and empire and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, a professor of international relations here at the LSE. So I'm very excited to be hosting this book launch. We've been planning to do it for quite a few months now, because I share with Darryl a long-standing frustration with the field both of terrorism and security studies, as well as some important, but nevertheless tending to be quite limited critiques of that field. So where the former reproduces tropes of the figure of the terrorist, the jihadi, the foreign fighter, tropes that are often racist, uninformed, flattening, and sometimes banal, or what Darryl Li himself in a very useful piece that I would recommend to fellow colleagues as a teaching tool, a jihadism anti-primer, called a secularized form of demonology, stemming from a place of horror that shuts down serious thinking about politics. And the latter, the critiques that sometimes they're many and multifaceted, sometimes trying to push back against the idea that all Muslims are terrorists, sometimes trying to present counterterror and the war on terror as an aberration of liberal politics. But nevertheless, all of them in some way, unfortunately, tend to circumvent any direct engagement with the figure of the jihadi, with the jihadi himself, and the wish and actual practices of people going to fight in the name of the Ummah, of Islam all over the world, and the ways that they have been doing so for a long time. So Darryl's book is, I think, among several important interventions that have been taking place over the last couple of years that have expressed similar kinds of frustrations in this field, which desperately needs more critical interventions, because it tackles that very demonized figure of the Islamist foreign fighter who wages jihad around the world, the one who's seen to spread violence, disregard national borders, and reject secular norms, and seemingly is opposed to the universal, especially universal liberal politics. So in his book, he departs from these conventional wisdoms, as he has been doing in various ways over the last many years, arguing that transnational jihadists are engaged in their own form of universalism, that they struggle to realize an Islamist vision for all of humanity and transcending and trying to work through various kinds of difference through this particular kind of Islamist vision. So just to give all of our audience a quick overview of the format, we're going to invite Darryl to give us an introduction and then have responses from Catherine and Tarak back to Darryl before we open up for questions. And we encourage all of you to, of course, submit your questions as they emerge while our panel is speaking. And there are three ways that you can do that. You can comment under the live stream that you're seeing wherever you're watching, probably on Facebook. Tweet at us on LSE Sociology or email sociology.media@lse.ac.uk. Maddie Giles, who has done our wonderful communications and events officer, who's done all of the background organizing for this event. Thank you, Maddie. Will be making sure that I will receive the questions and can pose them to the panel. So without any further ado, let me hand it over to Darryl.
Thanks so much, Mahvish, for your heroic efforts to organize this talk, which I think was actually has been in the works since before the pandemic started. So it's great to finally be here with you all. Thank you, Maddie, so much for everything you've done to make this event possible. I am really thrilled to be here in conversation with you all, and especially with Laura and Catherine. Many years ago, I was a student of Tarak Barkawi at Cambridge, and he set me on a path of thinking critically about many of the issues that emerged in this book. So if there's anything in it you don't like, you know who to blame. Also, Catherine, who I actually have never met before, but whose work I've long admired from afar. A lot of the most interesting and cutting edge kind of scholarship on the ex-Yugoslav region, especially around the questions of peacekeeping and race and transregionalism. I've learned so much from reading your work and engaging with your work, Catherine. So thank you so much for agreeing to be here today. So I'll just give a very quick overview of the book, and even quicker because I think Mahvish did a great job of sort of introducing it already. But the long and short of it is that for the past quarter century or so, conversations in world politics have been overshadowed by a particular kind of figure, right? Alternatively described as kind of the jihadist foreign fighter or Islamist foreign fighter, but essentially in armed conflicts around the world, from Afghanistan, Somalia, Chechnya, Kashmir, and so on, there's always been this kind of figure who seems to show up on the edge of the vision of external observers, right? And this figure is the sort of foreign Islamist fighter, people who are mobilized to risk their lives and inflict violence in the name of a vision of global Muslim solidarity. And it's precisely through the way that these folks seem to combine piety, violence, and transnational mobility outside of the framework of a national army or of a national military apparatus. It's that thing that seems to make these folks analytically a puzzle and challenging, and then also kind of normatively a problem, a figure of threat, right? So there's kind of this trope that you'll find in a lot of places, like, for example, when the US invaded Iraq, there was kind of an official discourse that, you know, there are Iraqis who are fighting back against the US, which is unfortunate, but also somehow understandable as kind of like a nationalist struggle. But these folks coming from outside, you know, they're the crazy ones, right? So it's this idea of their, like I said, their analytical and their normative unintelligibility that that's been kind of the puzzle that the book is trying to address. And of course, a huge part of this is understanding the backstory of organizations like Al-Qaeda and kind of the rise of the war on terror, right? Insofar as we have this spectrum of formations who are trying to organize violence either outside the nation state framework or in ways that seem to be really at odds with it. That's kind of the puzzle or the problem space that the book addresses. Now, there's a lot of books that talk about this phenomenon. I think what makes this one different is that it is based on talking to the folks who have been involved, and taking seriously the practical challenge of how they navigated all sorts of cultural, racial, and doctrinal differences in doing so. So the foreign fighter phenomenon to me is interesting because it raises the dilemmas that all universalist projects face. So as someone who had a previous career in kind of the human rights and humanitarian NGO world, you know, when I saw these people, I sort of recognized in a way a common structural dilemma, right? How do you get a bunch of folks from different countries acting in the name of some kind of vision directed at all of humanity, to figure out ways to coordinate with each other and also to connect with and convince a local population that has seen a lot of people from outside selling various ideas of what it means to be an ideal human subject. And that's why the book really focuses on the case study of the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina in the 1990s. For those who may not be aware, who may not have been alive at that time, the wars in ex-Yugoslavia kind of dominated the international agenda of the 1990s and kind of the early post-Cold War moment. So the United Nations sent its largest ever peacekeeping force at the time, 40,000 strong. The UN set up a war crimes court that became the model for the future International Criminal Court. And there were all sorts of it was kind of a crisis of identity and a crisis for the emergent kind of US-led global world order in the aftermath of the Cold War. It was also a crisis for the emergent project of the European Union as well, right? To have all of these kind of mass atrocities, quote unquote, on Europe's doorstep. This also converged with the, kind of a series of 50th anniversary commemorations of the end of World War II, the end of the Holocaust, and kind of the coalescing of a humanitarian conscience, right, that invoked certain ideas of the Holocaust as this ultimate mass atrocity that can never be allowed to repeat. So unlike other sites of mass atrocity that took place in the global South, in places like Rwanda, for example, the mass atrocities in ex-Yugoslavia kind of resonated with this sense of Holocaust consciousness for reasons of race, right? I mean, in a way, for international media audiences, seeing afflicted and victimized bodies, especially Black bodies in the global South, is sort of like, more or less treated, unfortunately, as sort of, CNN video wallpaper, right? But the mass atrocities in ex-Yugoslavia, because of their interpolation through the lens of whiteness, also attracted this enormous attention and concern in the international community, right? So for Bosnia, as a country that had a Muslim plurality, if not majority, there was this idea of, can the West, stand up to and live up to its values of secularism and tolerance by helping kind of, white Muslims, so-called. What has received a lot less attention is the importance of the Bosnia crisis among Muslim majority societies around the world. So this book is kind of one of the few to really address this, because there's also a fascination among Muslims worldwide around the idea of white Muslims, precisely because structures of race are global, right? So after several centuries of kind of European imperialism, even many Muslims throughout the world have kind of internalized an idea that, Muslimness and whiteness are somehow, contradictory categories. So there were obviously tons of forms of solidarity and support among Muslims worldwide for Bosnia, just as there were in the West, and especially for Muslims in the West. Aid activities, protests, letter writing, diplomacy, and so on. But the book really focuses in on the specific and, of course, notorious form of solidarity, which is armed intervention, right? So volunteers going and fighting, and shows how, contrary to a lot of the common perceptions of them kind of operating entirely out of a nation state framework, the book really shows how they combined a commitment to being part of a global Muslim community while also kind of integrating into a local context. So you have a situation where a battalion of half foreign Muslim fighters and half Bosnian Muslims is run by Arabs, raises its funds abroad, subscribes to a kind of Salafi orientation within Islam, but then at the same time is taking orders from an army that's run by people who may consider themselves to be not practicing Muslims or not even Muslims at all, and who are upholding kind of an avowedly non-sectarian multinational nation state of Bosnia-Herzegovina. So the first half of the book really kind of explores the dilemmas that arose from that, mostly based on sort of ethnographic life history interviews with Bosnian and Arab participants in the war, and also archival records from their internal deliberations. The second half of the book tries to situate the jihad against or in the context of these sort of larger universalist projects that folks may be more familiar with. So, for example, socialist non-alignment, United Nations peacekeeping, and the war on terror. These are really, really different kinds of formations, but what the book tries to do is to show how the method that's developed in the first half of the book of kind of doing a trans-regional social history can also be fruitfully applied to understanding these other phenomena. So with the context of non-alignment in Yugoslavia, the book shows how Arab students who came to Yugoslavia in the context of kind of socialist solidarity end up getting kind of re-racialized as potential, Islamist threats in the context of the war. And a small number of them actually do end up playing a crucial role as kind of translators and fixers and intermediaries for kind of the jihad fighters who are coming from outside. Then, as I mentioned, there's a chapter on UN peacekeeping that examines the role that that Muslims played in the UN peacekeeping force. So the UN peacekeeping force in Bosnia was almost a third Muslim. And for those folks, there's this really interesting phenomenon where they are acting both as kind of upstanding professional members of the so-called international community, while at the same time being engaged in kind of like pan-Islamic solidarity, right? And showing that these are not sort of inherently contradictory projects. And then the final chapter is about the war on terror. It's informed by experiences that I had representing a detainee in Guantanamo Bay, but also looking at how the war on terror kind of mobilized a whole global sort of carceral network whereby prisoners have been shuttled from one site to another, of which Guantanamo is really just the most visible exception. And the book really focuses on how, after the war, the US and EU kind of pressured Bosnia to set up various mechanisms to denationalize and deport Arab former jihad fighters who had kind of settled in the country. So anyway, that's kind of the broad arc of the book. I know we wanted to keep it short to 10 minutes, so I'm just going to turn it over to Tarak and to Catherine. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Darryl. I'm sure that we'll be hearing a lot more about the book also as the conversation moves forward. Catherine, I'd like to hand it over to you now.
Thank you. First of all, Darryl, I really need to congratulate you on this book. This is the kind of book I've wanted to exist for many years. I think partly I wrote Race in the Yugoslav region, my own book in 2018, out of frustration there weren't more books like this, works which put the Yugoslav wars and their aftermath into a truly globalized context of migration, security, and race. And I thought maybe if I make a contribution to theorizing this step, where I tried to do in that book, it makes studies like this more possible. And now here one is. And of course, this is work that you had already embarked on, long before I had, started putting that, particular theoretical contribution together. I think one of the dissatisfactions that moved me to start that work was the problem that a lot of critical anthropology of the post-Yugoslav region had already been wrestling with since the turn of the millennium. And that's, the way in which so much of the framework for understanding the Yugoslav wars and the post-Yugoslav space has reduced their social relations only to relations between ethnic subjects from the three main South Slav ethnic groups. So, this has left no space for subjects who aren't accounted for in any ethno-political schema of majority and minority ethnic groups, but are still connected to the region. It's left little enough space for Roma, let alone for those whose descent is from outside the region and who are racialized as non-white. Now, before we even start getting into talking about mujahids and the jihad, one example of that is actually the Chinese merchants who you mentioned briefly in your introduction, and who were selling clothes and household goods in smaller towns and cities at the time. And, anthropological agendas that solely understood the region through the lens of relations between its majority ethnic groups wouldn't know where to place them. In fact, neither do official statistics in the region. There's an excellent volume on Chinese migrants in Central and Eastern Europe and also Russia that Felix Chang edited with Sunny Ruka-Chang about 8 years ago now. And he estimated that, in the late 2000s in Serbia, there were between 20,000 and 30,000 Chinese people, similar to the numbers of Macedonians or Bulgarians. And yet the Serbian authorities recorded demography through the same 22 ethnic identities they'd inherited from Yugoslavia. They'd got no way of knowing, or counting specifically, how many Chinese people lived in Serbia. So this then had material consequences. Chinese traders, for instance, would have trouble proving that police were demanding bribes from them more than Serbian traders, which would have been evidence of police racism, because the enforcement figures in Serbia weren't specific enough that they could record treatment of Chinese traders as a group. So, this was one of the many questions which already was, sort of eating away, I think, at the prevailing kind of frameworks for the anthropology of post-socialism. And, of course, the mujahids whose mobilities you explore so sensitively here are another example of mobilities which even the new anthropology of post-socialist, post-conflict Bosnia and the rest of the region was still being slow to recognize even a decade or so ago, despite all the advances that it had made in deconstructing the politics of ethnicity, which of course was such an essential step in decentering the primacy of ethnopolitics in how researchers understand the region. When we're only looking for ethnic relations between South Slav ethnic groups in Bosnia, we miss these global connections. And we miss as well the ability to connect the region into the contemporary racialized global politics of security, which has been so urgent to do, or indeed into the global history of anti-colonialism, which connected Yugoslavia and the countries of origin of many of these mujahids through the non-aligned movement. And we see this with the book's very first example, of Iraqi and Baghdadi former mujahid who came to Bosnia, not as an Islamist volunteer in 1992 or 1993, like many did, but as a metallurgy student in 1979, one of the thousands of foreign students from non-aligned allies in Africa and Asia who suddenly become of so much interest to global historians of Yugoslav state socialism. So he settled in Zenica. When he felt the pressure to join the Bosnian army in January 1993 to help defend his family against Croat as well as Serb expansionism, he wanted to join a unit where troops prayed and didn't drink. Now history, as well as the US-led global security apparatus, knows him as a mujahid. The full everyday histories behind these fighters' presence in Bosnia, as opposed to the propaganda about them and the demonology around them, as you've put it, is nevertheless almost invisible in most studies of the Bosnian conflict. And perhaps one reason that struck me as so curious an omission and prodded me to start asking what frames of reference would we need to interpret the conflict through in order to include them. Because when I was a student in the early 2000s, starting to specialize in the history of the Yugoslav wars, one of the major human rights controversies in the UK, of course, was Marzan Beg's detention in Guantanamo. He'd spent time in Bosnia during the war, in his own words, did fight for a while. But one heard even less about men like Beg in the context of the Bosnian conflict than, say, British and Irish volunteers who had been fighting with Croat or Serb paramilitaries. And it did seem to be, as Shireen Razak would put it, a casting out of Muslims, especially Muslims racialized as brown, from the European space that the Yugoslav wars were imagined as taking place in, or at least on the borders of. So race in its global perspective really is a theme that your book puts fully into operation, and we cannot have too many books like that. What I wanted to do in race in the Yugoslav region was push myself and my field to think about race not just as analogy, but as connection. So, more than saying ethnic cleansing is like apartheid, or the stigmatization of the Balkans is like the stigmatization of blackness. Instead of that, we could ask, well, what ideological or material connections might there have been between the racial project of apartheid South Africa and the genocidal imagination of Radovan Karadžic's regime? Or how do actual imaginations of blackness circulate through, from, and back towards the Balkans? So what you've been able to do really kind of puts flesh on those conceptual bones. As you write, the scholarship's comparison of the Balkans to the non-white parts of the world has left few tools for probing the region's actual connections to them. And the result, as you observe, has been a history ultimately by, for, and about white people, however incomplete or precarious that whiteness may be. As you do all that, moreover, you leave us with exceptionally provocative, perhaps, but revealing juxtapositions. You ask, for instance, what's the difference between the solidarities of the global Ummah and the anti-colonial non-aligned solidarities that created or strengthened the routes through which those could be expressed in the 1990s? What's the difference, indeed, between foreign mujahids travelling to a region and foreign peacekeepers travelling to a region, who do both exercise power across boundaries, do both have visions of social transformation to implement, and do both get into awkward and asymmetric, intercultural and interlinguistic encounters with the local population. I'm so glad you're asking, by the way, well, where is all the translation and interpreting happening? Because that's what, one of the most basic everyday questions, that we need to ask about, peacekeeping or, any other kind of foreign military contact. So, if we find, that juxtaposition unsettling between mujahids and peacekeepers, as we might do, we need to ask ourselves why. And perhaps we might reply, well, the difference lies in the legitimacy and statehood of the entities which sent their troops as peacekeepers, or the endorsement that the UN Security Council gave to these peacekeeping operations. But we can't deny, once you've put it in these terms, that non-alignment, international peacekeeping, and the international jihad in Bosnia all invoked universalism of a kind, and how we morally regard each one forces us to articulate what we believe the tacit principles of international order are. Now, these are only some of the contributions of this frame-changing book. It does so much more than document the mobilities of the jihad in Bosnia, even though it does that with incredible richness and nuance. It globalizes how we can think about mobilities of security in the post-Yugoslav space. And it decenters liberal Western order and how we think about peacekeeping there. It makes non-white peacekeepers from the global south central to the history of UNPROFOR. It helps write religious mobilities back into the non-aligned movement. It creates more space for future scholars who aren't racialized as white to see themselves as potential ethnographers in Bosnia. And it explicitly names coloniality and the global hierarchies of race as part of the context for the Yugoslav wars and what happened next in Bosnia. So congratulations on this book, and may it inspire others, as I'm proud that my work has been able to help inspire yours.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for an incredibly rich response, and I'm sure that Darryl will also be coming back with a series of insights generated from what you've brought forward. I'd like to invite Tarak now to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Mahvish, and thank you very much, Catherine, for those very interesting remarks. I want to start out by emphasizing what a scholarly achievement this is. The term I've come up with is kind of perspectival ethnography. Sometimes Darryl appears as an ethnographer, and meets his subjects as an ethnographer. Sometimes Darryl appears as the lawyer that he is, the attorney he is, and he meets his subjects as an attorney. And sometimes he appears as an NGO worker and he meets them in that capacity. He's quite straightforward and he tells us all about this in his introduction. So some PhD students out there in Facebook land might want to go and have a look at that. Now, when you add to this the multiple competencies that Darryl is bringing to this, a trained attorney, a trained anthropologist, NGO human rights worker able to go and live in these places and work in these places, which is no easy thing. And on top of this, mastery of Arabic and enough local languages to get by in Bosnia, it's extraordinary. This is an extraordinary scholarly achievement. And Darryl's, perhaps his own best work, that he got himself to the point where he could master all of this. So I really feel it's necessary to get that out. Now, I approached this book from an IR department. I'm not a sort of normal IR scholar, but I approach it from that question. So I'm sort of free of the issues around anthropology and ethnography that Darryl himself has to wrestle with. This is, after all, a PhD dissertation. When we encounter the national international world, we encounter a world freighted with national essentialisms and sovereign essentialisms. It's overloaded with representations of territorial fixity, of boundedness. And it's exactly this boundedness of spaces and peoples which has organized the social sciences and humanities for so much of the time in which the modern scholarly enterprise has been underway. There is no discipline that is focused on the transnational or the space of the international, the space of thick co-constitutive social relations out of which the various entities that participate in world politics are formed. And so, you know, the discipline of IR, which ought to be focused on this, in fact reproduces this. And reproduces a division between foreign and domestic that organizes so much of its scholarship. And in the course of this, it not only reproduces universalisms as universalisms, rather than problematizing them, it takes sides. You know, I'm not as surprised as many are that security studies is a site through which the war on terror is fought. The entire purpose of the discipline of international relations and various other disciplinary forms that get started in the Cold War is to conduct a worldwide struggle and to build a US empire that dare not speak its name because it operates through a formally sovereign world, a horizontal world of supposedly independent, formally independent sovereign states. And all of that is something that Darryl is able to see through. And one of the things that, for me, and the reason I'm sort of laying this out at the beginning of my remarks, is why has it been that I have always found anthropologists some of the most interesting scholars to bust up this world this intellectual world that I've just described. Now, of course, anthropologists have their own implication in empire. They have their own implication in bounded spaces and peoples, but it's an implication that they've wrestled with as a discipline, maybe even too much, beating themselves up for their role in this. And so someone like Darryl is able to come and offer, I want to use the phrase that he uses, this is an anthropology of universalisms. And it's an ethnographic history from below of those universalisms, right? And that is a perspective on the kind of ideological categories of world politics of Cold War, 1990s, and the war on terror that is almost unutterable in mainstream international relations. But for an anthropologist, it's something that comes not quite naturally. I've just described the sort of scholarly achievement that is required to get there. But that, for me, is where I would situate this text. Now, let me say a few other things about this somewhat more specifically. One of the things that I want to draw out is a kind of parallel between Darryl and another anthropologist named Hyunik Kwan, whose masterly The Other Cold War is a book I'm teaching in the same course that I'm teaching Darryl's book, and has been very much on my mind as I read him. And one of the things that Kwan does is he takes to task post-colonial scholarship for forgetting about the Cold War, that the period of decolonization happened during the Cold War, and that modernity, world politics, in modern world politics in the period of the Cold War were bipolarized. And that bipolarization, this other color line, the anti-communist, communist color line, runs both between states and through them. And what Darryl does is he comes and reminds us that both the Cold War and the 1990s happened before the GWOT, and that they structured the GWOT in really fundamental ways. And he recovers this, as it were, prehistory of the GWOT, this prehistory of terrorism studies that enables and gives him critical leverage on the GWOT itself that others are often not able to achieve. I think one of the ways I kind of connect Kwan and what Darryl is doing, many critical terrorism studies people or people working in that area often made, if they had a historical sensibility, they often made the observation, what are we doing back in the enemy imaginary of the British Empire? right? Why is it all of a sudden, jihadis, militant Islam as this figure is suddenly populating our imaginaries in the way that it's doing? And what Darryl does is to remind us that decolonization, Cold War, and the 1990s came before that, and give us leverage on where these figures come from in a world prior to the global war on terror. One of the things that Darryl does in this Anthropology of Universalisms is he makes a distinction. It's not a major distinction in the book, but the two always sort of struck me as going together. What he says about the foreign fighters, the Muslim foreign fighters, is that when they arrive in Bosnia, they work to process differences, not to settle them. They are aware of their difference and of the difference of the local, and they work to find ways to work with, to not bring things to a head, to acknowledge these differences without resolving them. And this plays to their success in the situation that they're in, their relative success. But the universalism of the peacekeepers and of the international community as it arrives in Bosnia is in a way the same universalism of the paramilitaries. It's a universalism that wants to sort people into spaces. It wants to sort and resolve differences. And a question that I sort of have for Darryl is to think about relative, it's in a way an obvious observation, but it's something I'm kind of interested in, is the role of power differentials in shaping these two approaches to being a universal in a local, or a universal in a foreign space, and to sort of reflect on why it is that the powerful are often much less interested in processing difference than sorting it. Okay, so that was a question I have. I have a military question that maybe is for the after conversation. I would like to hear more about the command arrangements of the Katiba. I understood the stuff about its being run by a shura at the top, and that there's consensual stuff, but how do they structure their command arrangements in operations? I also want to point out, and I won't dwell on it, but I want to point out the parallel between Darryl's description of the Katiba as having these foreigners, as having locals, as having a whole array of differences in serving in both a national project, the Bosnian Civil War, but also in this universal project, in many ways is a kind of alter ego of a colonial army. I couldn't help but think of an Indian army officered by foreigners, engaged in both universal practices of fighting world wars, but also local practices and so on. It's a curious parallel there that was of interest for me for obvious reasons. And the final point that I want to make is a kind of punchline that Darryl gives us in the very beginning. Who has, we academics have certainly been critiquing the American empire, but who's been organizing transnational resistance to the American empire? Who are, as it were, the volunteers to the Spanish Civil War, or the Comintern in another moment? And that is Darryl's foreign fighters, and they've been doing it for a long time. And I would like to kind of give credit where credit is due. It's a horrible sort of outcome, but the West has been disassembled. This is happening in front of us. The United States that was able to do the things that appear in Darryl's book is no longer with us. It's no longer a credible sovereign that can act through other spaces and dispense, justice in some kind of legitimate way, or a way that's perceived as legitimate. Unlike the Comintern and the volunteers to the Spanish Civil War, foreign militant Islam has really had some effects. And I think that's something worth pointing out. It may not be just the world that they intended to achieve, but it's definitely an enemy that they've defeated. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Tarak, for your comments. I'll just hand it back to you, Darryl.
Thanks to both of you for those incredibly just rich and generative comments, and so generous and thoughtful. Thank you. But I think the common thread in what you were saying is the question of scale, right? I feel that what has happened is there's been a lot of, as you mentioned, a lot of critique of the conventional categories of international relations. But then sometimes there's this question of like, well, what's the alternative framing, right? Because of course, you can deconstruct things, but then we need other concepts to kind of rebound them and develop insight. And with anthropology, like historically, stereotypically, it was operating in a micro scale, right? So if IR was always obsessed with states and nations, anthropology is obsessed with, tribes and ethnic groups. And in a way, I think what's happened is that the critical IR impulse and then the critical impulse within anthropology to avoid that kind of reification, there's kind of this meeting in the middle, right? And I think that helps to explain the moments of like connection that that you as an IR scholar sort of recognize, right? And I guess so the kind of conceptual frameworks that I'm kind of shaped by, and this of course comes from my doctoral advisor, Eng Sang Ho, are diaspora and empire, and is neither kind of the state nor kind of like the local tribe. And diaspora and empire are helpful because they can give us ways of thinking about things that happen across long distances and across forms of difference. They're not without their own problems, of course, right? So with empire, it's funny, there's this way, we can kind of epistemologically benefit from thinking through imperial frames, but then that gets weird if we end up kind of reifying the actual institutional, structures that empires were. And then diaspora also, is imagined in many different ways, but it's also vulnerable to this idea to certain notions of like kinship and belonging and blood and so on that are also, have their own issues. So one of the other kind of conceptual moves that I was trying to do at the book was to talk about universalism as a framework in which, and as a way to like corral and make use of the categories of empire and diaspora without being totally kind of beholden to them. But the downside of the way that I'm kind of thinking about universalism, because it scales from small to big, is that there's a certain kind of ephemerality to it, right? So the fact that you have all of these transnational jihads popping up in different places, it's not crazy that people think that they're all kind of the same horde of fighters moving from one place to another. And while there certainly are continuities, what I found is that there's actually a lot of people who are coming into it for the first time, but there is a pre-existing set of, for lack of a better term, like cultural resources, right? Like notions of like what Islam is that are rooted in, just centuries of disputation, institutional development, discourses, arguments, and so on, that can be kind of like appropriated, made use of, reinvented, recrafted in a given context. So in that sense, the more kind of like socially thick categories like religion, diaspora, whatever, I think they're there. They're always going to be there, and they're important and they're relevant even for the nation state. But it's how they get brought into play in a political analysis that I think is tricky. And that's where I try to sort of, use universalism as kind of a way of doing that. And that connects with the power differential point that you make, right? So one of the other structural features of universalism that I think we don't tend to, so there's two. One is that I think people often kind of talk about universalism in kind of this loose sense of like homogenizing and getting rid of all differences, which I try to show is like really not the way to think about it. But then another thing is that it's not just about, and this is what the last chapter gets into, it's not about like friend or enemy or us versus the other. It's about deciding on behalf of other people who the other is, right? And I think that's something that obviously a powerful universalist project can get away with much more than a less powerful one. So when the mujahideen show up in a place like Bosnia, of course, they don't like the idea that the Bosnian government is appealing to the US and is trying to get on the side of the US. But there's really not anything they can do about it, right? Whereas when the US comes in and says, okay, it's time to get rid of the jihad fighters, they have a whole discourse of the Bosnians are local Muslims, the Arabs are foreign Muslims, we are actually protecting, we are guardians of Muslim plurality, right? And the fact that that has any kind of plausibility and any kind of purchase is exactly what, what a powerful universalism has that a weaker one doesn't. There's a lot more that I want to respond to in that, but I think I'll just leave it at that for now, in the interest of time. Catherine, yeah, thank you again for all of that. I'm really glad you brought up the Chinese merchants, because of course that was, what I was constantly being interpolated as while I was in Bosnia. And yeah, I do think that, and there have been conversations around this in Eastern European studies, right, around questions of race in kind of the discipline, in the scholarly space. And yeah, I mean, even for myself, thinking of my own training and formation, I did a lot of this work in a way outside of the networks of scholarly training and formation that specialize in Eastern Europe, right? And so, I think there's a lot to be said there. And I also want to really just come back to the point that we both made, but I think you made it really well here, and I think your book is really valuable for, which is really moving beyond this idea of analogy. And this is a broader issue in theorizations around race. I think there's more awareness finally around the perils of the politics of analogy, right? And so obviously this is a huge issue in the United States, where both the visibility of the movement for Black lives and also the kind of like neoliberal re-co-optation of a lot of language around racial justice has, I think, led to a lot of concerns around how do we think about histories of slavery and of racialization of Black people. How do we think about the theory that comes out of it, but also in a way that doesn't always fall into kind of this analogy, which can actually also be a form of appropriation and expropriation. So I think the move that you're trying to push people to make, especially in studies of the region, around like actual connections, right? So as you said, it's not just that the Balkans are like these other places, it's what about people from those places in the Balkans, right? Like that's really just, it's phenomenally valuable and important. And I also, and I think it really comes from that practical question that you brought up around translation, and your early work around translators in UN peacekeeping forces, and which also kind of resonates with sort of one of Tarak's points, where I think it's, there's so much that's written about these kind of institutional formations like UN peacekeeping, in again, reifying kind of national categories, reifying the institutions, and so little attention to the actual social textures of what's involved, right? A UN peacekeeping mission is no less a socially embedded, culturally, shaped institution than, the tribal jirga down the street if you were in Afghanistan, for example. And I think, again, this is such it's a very, it's a classic kind of move, right, of like conceptual and temporal co-evality, right? How do we actually talk about these actors, in a kind of common space, while at the same time, of course, centering the differences kind of in power and in structure among them. And also I should mention that this frustration that Catherine identified around kind of this overemphasis on inter-ethnic, kind of relations and so on. This is a frustration that is also, and I know you know this, Catherine, but I just want to put this out to the audience, is something that you see with scholarship in the region itself. Like, I think there's a lot of interesting work that's coming out of research institutes and universities, especially in Serbia and Croatia, around the non-aligned movement. And there was actually a workshop recently held in Belgrade, and I think the videos are available online, that are trying to sort of explore those histories as well. Now, of course, there's other debates and problems that can be had with that historiography, but I think this attempt to really think about the Western Balkans or ex-Yugoslavia in this broader kind of global context is a really sort of welcome move and an overdue one, and it's been really interesting to sort of watch it unfold.
Thank you so much, Darryl. And I'm sure that you have a lot of other thoughts and responses to both Tarak and Catherine and vice versa. So while we wait for audiences to also ask questions, let me go ahead and throw one to you, another one from myself, or maybe perhaps two. One is to pick up on actually the comment that Tarak made as he began, which was the fact that you know, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that your ability to write this book was precisely dependent methodologically on the fact that you do transgress certain sets of boundaries that we are usually asked to uphold within the academy, both in your lawyering and as an anthropologist, but also in your other kinds of commitments which led you to do the lawyering. I also know that in one of perhaps one of the critiques of the book, which I have read, has been kind of angry at you for doing that, right? and I'd like, or perhaps I'm misremembering this, but I'd like you to comment about some of the possibilities and perhaps essential insights that came from these kind of disciplinary and also extra university transgressions. And the way that it's managed to break methodological nationalism and disciplinary divides, and the way that it has helped you also shape a lot of the questions that you have. The other question that I want to throw your way is about, it is actually picking up on three things that have also been commented on. One is what the comment that you just made in terms of what Catherine was bringing up, about the importance of moving beyond the analogy around race. Also, when we think about Muslims, and I guess, and I'm thinking, and then I thought of what you just said earlier around the Bosnian as a white Muslim figure. And it made me think about other kinds of divisions within Muslims, of course, primarily in your book, for very good reason, you talk about, you know, the various kinds of schools of interpretation and doctrinal differences, but primarily among Sunnis. And I was wondering, because in this time, a variety of Muslim communities, Ahmadi, Ismaili, Shia, they're all feeling solidarity with what's happening in Bosnia, but not all of them will be included in this universalist project. And in your juxtaposition with peacekeeping, with global war on terror, one part of it is, of course, that universalism works through the politics of difference, but it also produces a series of exclusions and has, and that also exists within, you know, this worldwide vision. And I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about that claim, which you called claim that they are guardians of Muslim plurality, when in fact, you know, the pluralism of non-Sunni groups often, especially some of the heavily marginalized ones, is perhaps not included, is often not included in that vision. So that other side of universe. And I've also heard sort of a definition of universality in other contexts as ideas that have the backing of an army or of violence. And the ability to exclude. So for now, those two questions. Of course, I also invite Catherine, Tarak, and our audience to engage further with Darryl.
Do you want me to respond to that, or do we want Catherine and Tarak to come in on this first?
As Catherine and Tarak, if you guys have anything.
Well, I mean, I've been having a thought that I think comes to me through, you know, if we, you know, we've got this track of, you know, influence and inspiration we've been talking about, and, you know, one of the scholars whose work was so generative for me in, you know, that early work on, you know, peacekeeping and translation and language encounters that you were talking about, was Marcia Henley, and, you know, her work, you know, first on the everyday spaces of security in peacekeeping. And, you know, also she's, you know, someone who is, you know, extremely interested in race and international peacekeeping, in peacekeepers from the global south, in the Balkans, in Western Balkan peacekeepers in the global south, and so on. And, you know, I think holding those two things together, you know, both of which, you know, her work has shown me how to look for. makes me think sort of from, you know, from your perspectives and the context that you've researched, you know, how might taking the everyday as our point of departure maybe open up more space to think about race and post-coloniality in a peacekeeping context than there might otherwise be?
Darryl, if you go ahead and respond both to that, then we actually have a few questions from the audience after.
Okay, cool, great. Yeah, I mean, I would just kind of echo your question back, Catherine, but actually expand it, which is beyond peacekeeping. I think the entire apparatus of international institutions is so deeply, deeply kind of like striated with questions of race and class and colonialism in ways that I still think are just really, really, I mean, it's the common sense. You meet people who work in the UN or these institutions and they all know it, they all talk about it, right? And, you know, and it comes with like, you know, coded ideas of like competence as well, and, you know, and, but then also the class dimension of it is so incredibly important, right? Because it's not just anyone coming from the global South. So I think this is, you know, this is something that of course is, we see it in peacekeeping precisely because of the coercive interface with kind of the populations who are being peace kept, right? But I think it's also just a broader question of all of these sort of institutions and their bureaucracies and so on. And I think it's incredibly, it's an incredibly like rich, you know, area of future sort of research and things to expand upon. It's also been interesting to me because in the US space, the turn to global history has sometimes been kind of criticized for sort of, you know, recapitulating kind of older imperial historiography. I think a slightly more generous but still actually quite damning interpretation is that the attention has moved from like the top level statespeople to the mid-level sort of lawyers, thinkers, and technicians who made this stuff, right? Which I think is still an interesting and important move. But again, the questions around kind of like race and colonialism, whatever there, are still super, super important. And I think it's something to be mindful of, because as we see more work that tries to challenge this, there's also the temptation of creating a parallel narrative where it's you know, very high level statespeople of other races who suddenly become the protagonists, right? And we're still not in a situation of like, what are, you know, non-statespeople sort of actually kind of, you know, up to and experiencing. As far as the this question of universalism and exclusions, Mahvish, that you brought up. Oh, this question of this line about the guardian of Muslim pluralism. Just to be clear, that's a line that the U.S. is the way that they think of themselves. I mean, it's true also of the jihad, right? Like they will. It's very, you know, they were embarrassed about, not embarrassed, but it was awkward to bring up questions around like, well, why were there no Shia in the Katiba, for example, right? And again, I think it is just an inherent feature of all universalist projects that, you know, they are going to generate these kinds of exclusions, and that's interesting, and we should sort of think with that. The Bosnian moment, the Bosnian crisis in particular, is a very, very interesting generative episode for thinking about the politics of pan-Islamism, precisely because it's a struggle that gains sympathy from so many different constituencies that are often at odds, right? So both revolutionary Iran and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, for example, were actively supporting the Bosnian cause. And in fact, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, early during the Syrian war, he responded to allegations of sectarianism in Syria by saying, well, Hezbollah fought in Bosnia. We stood up for Sunnis. And actually, Hezbollah has acknowledged losing 2 people in the war in Bosnia. So there's always, and it also in places like Turkey, for example, you know, the way that the Bosnia crisis kind of activated certain memories of like Ottoman sort of belonging and so on was something that actually appealed to both Kemalists and kind of like Islamists alike. So there's this funny feature of solidarity politics. You see this with Palestine a lot as well, where sometimes the further away a conflict is, the easier it is for people to agree about it because they maybe just know less, or there's less at stake through the lack of proximity. But yes, I think this issue of exclusion is extremely important, especially with the Syria crisis, it's the most obvious, right? Where both sides are drawing on and activating sort of discourses of pan-Islamism and speaking to the Ummah, right? And neither side wants to be, no matter how sectarian they are, neither side wants to give up on the possibility of speaking for the whole Ummah, right? So they'll always make at least some kind of token, attempt to appeal to sort of like a broader constituency, which I think is really interesting. As far as the first question about transgression is concerned, I know it's very fashionable to talk about, being interdisciplinary and sort of, doing lots of different things. I think it's important to make sure that you are grounded in a specific set of concepts and conversations, and to know what your primary kind of identity is in a way, or point of intervention is. And then you can kind of build outwards from that, right? Having a sense of what the priority of the ideas is. So although, yes, I am an attorney and I am also a legal scholar, this is a book that, I had to reconcile myself to the choice of, this is an work of anthropological scholarship first. And the other competencies or techniques or whatever that I might have access to can be brought into the service of the project, whether more successfully or less successfully. But I think it's important to have that sense of grounding and that sense of priority, precisely because I feel like the invocation of interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity is so common. And I'm also concerned about it being frankly weaponized in kind of the labor struggles around academic production, right? It's a kind of a slippery slope between celebrating interdisciplinarity and essentially multiplying labor demands on scholars, right? So I think it's important just to be kind of aware of that and to know what you're trying to accomplish kind of first and foremost. I'm not sure if I answered your question about the angry. Are you talking about like the person who said that I'm interviewing people who are detained, and is that the issue, or was it something else?
Why don't we take that one up after?
Okay, all right. Sorry, no, I just wanted to make sure I addressed all the questions.
No, you absolutely did. Thank you. Actually, it's pretty useful because it's interesting because you simultaneously the access that maybe some of these other, being an attorney and otherwise, gave you were important, but it's definitely important that you also grounded yourself in anthropology. So we have two questions from the audience. The first is from, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing this, but Tiziana Maria Antonietti. Is universalism itself always reserved for European or Western ideas and struggles? Are there any notable counterexamples, maybe anti-Westernism in Asia or pan-Islamism as universalism? What's the empire of the foreign fighter? Does he or she want an empire? Let me also ask the second one from Aicha Chibukchu. What is your argument about what a global left can learn from the internationalism practiced by your interlocutors?
Great, thanks for those questions. If the first question, if I understand it correctly, of course I completely reject the idea that universalism is the sole monopoly or property of the West. And the claim of the book is precisely to show how this can be thought with, not just as a rhetorical claim, like other people do universalism too, but to look at how when another group that is conventionally seen as not being able to practice universalism, when you appreciate the way that it does do that, you actually think about what universalism is like, what it looks like generally. I do want to be clear, and I think I've also, enabled this problem. For me, universalism is more of a heuristic category than a substantive one, by which I mean, I don't want folks to read this book and be like, okay, well, let's go around and like make a list of like what are the real universalisms and what are the what are not, right? Like for me, universalism is kind of just a conceptual tool for kind of making sense of this group of people who seem to be so otherwise difficult to categorize or difficult to analyze. And not only does it give us a better sense of what they're up to, it also opens up a set of comparisons and questions, with other phenomena that they're not frequently compared to, right? Like in this case, peacekeeping and the war on terror, and to see how generative that might be. But it is very much kind of like an instrument of analysis, kind of in that sense. So, and also, do the foreign fighters want an empire? No, but is my answer to that, in the sense that the common goal of the people who I was studying in Bosnia was to defend Bosnia, right? And they were very explicit that people might have had other baggage from other movements they might have been part of, and they were told, pretty explicitly, you have to leave that at the door. And when the war ended and the Bosnian government, under US pressure, disbanded this jihad unit, the people involved, went along with it, and they went off to other places. Now, at the individual level, you have people who believe all sorts of things, right? So there were individuals who fought in the jihad in Bosnia who later on joined Al-Qaeda. You have individuals who later, 20 years later, end up being part of ISIS, right? And I think you can find a whole range of kind of ideological opinions at the individual level, which I think is probably true of like any state army, right? So part of the problem with a lot of the sort of security studies discourse on this that's been so reductive is kind of just assuming that anyone who is Muslim and travels to fight not as part of a state army is kind of just on board for any number of projects, right? So what these people were doing was not necessarily opposed to the Al-Qaeda project of confronting the United States, but signing on to one didn't necessarily mean signing on to the other. As far as Aicha's question, yeah, I think this sort of relates to the point that Tarak brought up earlier. I think the lesson for the global left, whatever that might mean, is that I think the collapse of state socialisms in the 1990s, not all of them, but most of them. Okay, so on the one hand, there's this moment of, left projects being kind of discredited and written off as utopian and so on and so forth. But after you get over that hangover, right, and that's kind of what we've been seeing since especially 2008, there's this other shadow, which is that insofar as left movements are still predominantly oppositional, they are not struggling under the burden of having to explain away the failures of state projects, because enough time has passed, memories have faded somewhat, not entirely. And in a way that is liberating, and in a way it lets people off the hook for having to think about political violence. I think, especially with the developments in the United States in recent years, that abdication of thinking about political violence is more and more, I mean, I would have said academically it's an overlooked point, but now it's actually becoming politically irresponsible, because we are in a moment in the United States where the relationship between state and extra state forms of white supremacy is evolving in really scary ways. And I think the organizational thinking around this stuff, at least in terms of like what we can think of as the platformed left, is not really addressing a lot of this stuff, as far as I can tell. So I think that's that's something that I would really like to draw attention to. And as I mentioned in the introduction, it's not at all that I'm suggesting that the people in this book are objects of emulation, right? But the fact is they have been trying to do this, however problematically or imperfectly. So it does seem like it's worth kind of, taking consideration and studying sort of what they were up to in a serious way.
Thank you so much, Darryl. Catherine and Tarak, if you guys have any questions that come up for you, please do ask. In the meantime, I'll throw another one at you from the audience, Darryl. We have this from an LSE IR MSc student, maybe one of Tarak's students. Darryl said that thinking about empire becomes awkward once we end up reifying the same institutional structures empire creates. Could you give an example of an instance in which this happens?
That's a great question. So I think, I think the example that I would give is sort of one thing that I found myself doing when I wrote the book, right? Which is that in the first chapter, the way that I push back on a kind of nation state framing around, so the nation state framing around foreign fighters asks, how many people come from each of these countries, and how, let's come up with a list of variables to correlate, which countries are sending more foreign fighters per capita. And so the first chapter says, okay, hold on, that's bonkers for a number of reasons. Let's explore this through looking at the biography of an individual who was one of the leaders of the jihad. And I show that although he's often glossed as a Saudi citizen, which he was also a part of this Hadrami diaspora from the Hadramaut region of southern Yemen. And in this sense, I was really kind of inspired by the work of my doctoral advisor, Eng Seng Ho, who also works in the Hadrami diaspora. In that particular case, if I had just if I had stopped there and said, the jihad just builds on all of these diasporic networks, and left it at that, right? Or in the case of the peacekeepers, if I had said, okay, well, look, these Pakistanis, right, their unit traces its origins back to the 19th century and whatever, that would have been okay. It would have been fine, because I think, again, we would have highlighted an important continuity that is overlooked. But if the analysis stops there, then you're not able to take into account so many other ways that like the peacekeeping unit or the jihad sort of formation are kind of getting configured into different sort of areas of political struggle. So I guess in a way it's a very small point, but just to say that the frameworks. So if earlier in response to Tarak's question, there's the first move, which is the critical move, where you kind of blow up the old framework, say the nation state. Then the second step is you kind of find an alternative framework to sort of rebound all of the ideas and put the pieces back together in some way. Then the third step, I think, is to then re-engage with or engage anew the categories that you blew up in the first step, right? So in this case, I would say, it's yes, empire and diaspora helped make sense of the jihad fighters who were going to Bosnia, but it doesn't then follow that somehow the Bosnian nation state or that Bosnian nationalism are irrelevant or fall out of the picture, right? It's that we want to revisit that ongoing conversation about the nation state and nationalism, but to shed light on it in a kind of underappreciated sort of aspect or way that might not have been there otherwise.
Yes, please, Tarak, go ahead.
I just wanted to make one point about Darryl's mention of the need to think through political violence and the very scary moment that we're in the United States. I would suggest that everyone on the global left help us stop the United States from becoming a fascist state, because if it does, we're really in trouble. I know that's to center everybody on our problems, but I think that there may be a reason for that. But I just wanted to point out the way in which the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the role of veterans, as well as just imagery from these wars, has meant that the white supremacist militias in the US have acquired many of the trappings of the jihad. Those sort of moments when you see all the pickup trucks driving into Portland, it looks like ISIS. They're flying flags. They're also, organized as militias employing extra state violence to achieve their projects. So there's a funny way in which they've picked up from this kind of syncretism of the war on terror and brought it home to the heart of white supremacy.
Yeah, just to add to that. Oh, sorry, Catherine.
Yeah, I mean, if I can add to that as well before you go on. At the same time as they're doing all that, they're also looking up to they're looking up for the project of the Bosnian genocide.
Yeah, thank you. So I just wanted to say that so folks may or may not have heard of the Mujahideen, which is a sort of I'm not sure how ironic it is, but a self-conscious take on the Mujahideen. So this is one of these kind of right-wing, kind of white nationalist groups that several of whose members were actually indicted by the federal government because they were entrapped in a sting operation where the FBI posed as members of Hamas, and they essentially made an agreement to, I don't know, exchange weapons or something, right? So there, but this idea of this notion of imitation of kind of, racialized others and appropriation is something that has a very, very deep history in kind of in settler culture in the United States, thinking all the way back to the Boston Tea Party, right? The Boston Tea Party was one of a series of, actually, this is a very common act of protest in the English colonies in North America, where colonists who were opposed to royal metropolitan authority would, essentially dress in red face, right, as a way of enacting their violent protests, right, which has all sorts of things to do with, the way that they interpolated natives, and also the way that they wanted to, the way that they thought about violence and kind of its cultural sort of aspects and so on. And then also, yeah, with Catherine's point, the Bosnian genocide has played a really sort of striking role in a lot of the kind of white nationalist thinking. A lot of it was, I think, with I mean, Catherine, you might know more about this than me, but so Anders Breivik talks a lot about it in his manifesto, and it feels to me more like a European neo-Nazi trope that there's like a delayed arrival in kind of the US space. I could be wrong about that. I haven't traced kind of all of the trajectories of this, but it is a really interesting kind of moment, because it's also the Bosnia sort of, unsettles all of these kind of, assumptions around race and whiteness as well, right? So the anxiety is, oh, these people can evade racial profiling, white Al-Qaeda and so on. And I imagine for white nationalist groups, like many other groups that are invested in kind of purity and boundary maintenance, right? The Balkan cases become very, they demand a lot of attention, right? And they cry out for some kind of understanding within that framework, within that worldview.
Thank you, Darryl. Again, Tarak and Catherine in the audience, if you have any questions, I'll go ahead and ask you one, which is a little bit about, again, picking up on a comment that was made earlier about potentially disassembling of American superpower. And also another kind of mimicking, of course, of counterterror by China and Uyghurs, and then also by the Modi regime in Myanmar, Rohingya. So 2 questions around that. Like, I mean, their counterterror, I mean, how do you think about those counterterror policies in terms of your analysis of universalism and its traveling over there and to India and elsewhere? And 2, how does, among many of your interlocutors, we haven't seen sort of jihadi fighters plan to travel to China or plan to travel to Myanmar. And how do you think about that? I mean, of course, Kashmir, they have, but how do you think about those 2 spaces vis-a-vis your interlocutors?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So I'm not as familiar with mobilizations around Xinjiang, but with Burma, Burma has been a longstanding issue of concern for these kinds of movements. So even going back to the 80s, a lot of the literature that I was reading about jihad in Afghanistan in Arabic talked a lot about Muslims in the Philippines and Burma in particular as similar kind of objects of solidarity and concern. My sense is that, I mean, there's the obvious thing, which is that I think the US has just still an overwhelming presence that shapes kind of questions of pushback. But my sense is that in at least in the Arab world, however one might define it, the issues in Xinjiang have not caught on in the same way. And I think part of it is the regimes, of course, have their interests with China and are not interested in kind of, whipping this up. And also, I think there's a certain amount of fatigue and disillusionment with these kinds of mediatized spectacles of atrocity, especially after the Syrian war, and a lot of skepticism, actually. So a lot of the conversations that I've seen kind of in a lot of the Arab countries are, there's just a lot of doubt about kind of these media reports about what's happening in Xinjiang, which is obviously, really unfortunate. The other thing that I would say is that the travel of the war on terror discourse between these different regimes, it's undeniably there. And of course, there is mimicry and there is, sort of immunization, right? Like, you do it too, so don't tell us, that we shouldn't do it. That being said, I think in terms of understanding how it plays out on the ground, I just imagine, again, not having studied it myself, that that the particularities are going to be a lot more salient. And if anything, for those who are interested in doing research on kind of like anti-Muslim discourses or politics in places like India and China, I would say you can't get around understanding and engaging with the local contexts. And you should start from there. And this, again, even with the Bosnian Jihad, it was important for me, even though I don't kind of consider myself an expert in ex-Yugoslavia or specialist, but I thought it was important to at least try to understand enough and know enough of kind of the local history and languages to build an analysis that really doesn't just give us an idea of a phenomenon that pops up in the same way in different places, right? Like, I think it's important that we not reduce these places to case studies as such. So I think, yeah, especially for a lot of the work on, because even as Islamophobia as a conceptual category gets more purchase in the academy, which I think is also something that has a really interesting and slightly fraught kind of racial baggage that's associated with it. As that gets applied to contexts that are increasingly different, on the one hand, it's important because we need ways of thinking about and organizing around things that are happening, but it's also very important, I think, to not be reductive and to actually like approach the contexts in as careful a way as possible.
No, thank you. There's definitely some really amazing recent research by more critical Chinese scholars on the longer histories of the relationship between Xinjiang as the frontier and the rest of sort of China and Han China. Do Tarak and Catherine have any?
Just a very quick point on Xinjiang. It lacks spectacular violence, which is an attractive force for foreign intervention. That violence has been kept largely out of the media, and the nature of that genocide is cultural erasure, social erasure, rather than violent elimination. So I think, in addition to the reasons that Darryl is citing, that the sort of lack of a violent incitement to this is really quite significant. I think one of the things that happens when you have this, what you call this immunization, so it's interesting, this trading of sanctions now. The West, as giver of justice, speaker of justice, sanctions people for involving themselves in crimes against humanity, or as defined by Western regimes. But the ability of China today to do that back to British officials and American officials, as it were, drains that maneuver of the same force that it had prior to that. And I think this is another index in the decline of Western world power.
Thank you, Tarak. We have another question from Leonie Basting, also MSc IR, one of Tarak's students. I was wondering about the intersection of race, gender in the mobilization of universalisms and how this was represented in your work.
Yeah, thank you. So the mobilizations that the book talks about are deeply gendered as masculine. So one of the things that the book talks about is how the fighters in most cases were not just, getting up one day from home and traveling thousands of miles away. They were already migratory in some way. They were migrant workers, they were students, they were refugees. And those circuits of movement in which they were operating were deeply masculinized. Now, that is not to say that Muslim solidarity with Bosnia was an entirely masculine affair at all, right? So if you look at the broader because again, as I mentioned earlier, people who traveled to fight is a very, very small part of the overall picture of Muslim solidarity with Bosnia. So all of the other forms of solidarity that are going on, the fundraising, the sending of aid, the protests and whatever, that was an area where women not only participated, but were arguably very prominent in a number of contexts. Now, of course, it's difficult to generalize across, all sort of Muslim societies, but I actually had a really interesting discussion about the book with a self-described Arab women's book club, mostly composed of, professionals, Western educated women, about, sort of in their 30s, 40s, from Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. And, they were all just fascinated because the book brought them back to their memories of childhood and adolescence, of all of the kind of Bosnia solidarity stuff that they were doing. And the activities that they mentioned were often conducted within kind of like domestic feminized spaces, right? So as women were getting together to do any number of forms of sort of gendered sociality that they were engaged with, that was also a space where things like, the fundraising and the watching of videos and the compiling of aid was sort of there and important. But yeah, but nevertheless, I think, a study of this kind of solidaristic activity that not only addresses gender, but also addresses women, since those are not exactly the same thing, would have been a different book, right? And I think this is something that, people have like remarked on with the book. And yeah, I think the limitations are there. And I just, can only try to be as honest as I can about them and sort of, what can be done and what cannot be done, given kind of the conceptual choices that were made sort of early on in the formation of the project.
Thank you, Darryl. We have about 4 minutes left now, so I thought it might be quite nice to round out with a couple of final comments from maybe starting from Catherine and Tarak, and then end with you, Darryl. Catherine, go ahead.
I think if I had one final comment, maybe it might be, where do you see these kind of solidarities going next? And, especially since we've heard, how specific to each political moment and also each technological moment they are.
I have a lot of questions, but they're probably not last ones to ask. But I wanted to give you an opportunity, Darryl, to say something about the connection, if any, between this project and your next project, what you're doing next.
Yeah, I think, Catherine, with your question, it kind of depends on which solidarities we're thinking about, right? Like, I think the sort of jihad mobilization has both been fueled, the transnational kind, has both been fueled, but also exhausted by the tensions and conflict between what we can broadly think of as a statist orientation, exemplified by ISIS, right, and kind of like a, I don't know, network orientation is kind of exemplified by Al-Qaeda. And it's been really interesting because the terrorism watcher circles have been really kind of worked up in the past few months around rumors that Ayman al-Zawahiri, bin Laden's number 2 and his successor, has been rumored to have been dead of natural causes for months. And Al-Qaeda kind of like released this video a few weeks ago saying, okay, we have a video of al-Zawahiri, so everyone got excited, proof of life, whatever. And then the video proceeded to have no proof of life. I think it was mostly talking about the Rohingya, if I'm not mistaken, and old footage of the Zawahiri was played. So it actually just worked up all of the speculation again around whether this guy is is still alive or not. And in a way, it's kind of emblematic of the state of this debate, right? Where I think we are now a generation into or in many ways longer, to this particular form of transnational mobilization in the name of jihad. Now, of course, this doesn't exhaust all potential ways of understanding or invoking the category of jihad. But I think anyone who wants to do it in a transnational context has to contend with this, everything that's been done and all of this sort of like disillusionment and exhaustion that's been furthered. But of course, the thing with the dominant powers is they never know how to quit while they're ahead, right? So it's always possible that they can create new conditions for kind of igniting these kinds of mobilizations. But again, rage and blowback, if you will, is only one component, right? We still need to think with the sort of organizational, infrastructures and mobilizational opportunities that may or may not exist. As far as other forms of solidarity, that I think is really an open question, and I don't know, because on the one hand, we've all been talking about, this sort of dissolution or realignment of these ruling consensuses, right, in the US and Europe, and what this means for the left and fascism and so on and so forth, but then also the rise of China at the same time. Right. So maybe that the nearer future is less about these kinds of stateless networks of the kind that I'm writing about, and more about a return to sort of, great power competition. Right. And what does that now? I think even then, these sorts of networks and these sorts of folks who have a disaffected relation with the state and with the international legal order, they will still be relevant. Right. But how that will play out is actually, I have no idea. And that's just a really interesting sort of open question to be thinking with. Yeah, Tarak, my next project was supposed to be about mercenaries and migrant military workers in the Gulf. And that, of course, I was doing field work last year, and that totally got upended by the pandemic. I think that sort of history of the present of global capital is one that actually can be written from the perspective of the Gulf. And that's what I would like to do by putting kind of these military formations at the center. So the connection with the previous book is, that again, for those who may not be aware, the Gulf countries, the GCC countries, their reliance on foreign labor is huge in their militaries, as well as kind of in the private sector and the things that people know about, building soccer stadiums and so on. And again, the idea of the national army, right, as kind of like our default for thinking about violence, both analytically and also in terms of legitimacy, is one that doesn't really apply there. And just as the sort of jihad fighters are seen as, these folks, so-called mercenaries, are kind of purely interpolated as, economic subjects, right? And so again, the project is about sort of just thinking about that in more depth and with more subtlety, but then also asking, how does that help us think differently about political violence, and its intersections with race and capital and empire, in different ways, across the board. But, we'll see how that goes.
Thank you so much. We're looking forward to your next project, Darryl. And thank you to Catherine and Tarak for your time. Thank you to Maddie for doing all the behind the scenes work. And thank you, Darryl. And congratulations on your book again.
Thanks to all of you. This was a lot of fun. Thank you.